May 15, 1944. A bright morning sun crested over the jungle canopy of New Guinea, illuminating the airfield at Hollandia, where Imperial Japanese Navy Lieutenant Takeshi Yamamoto walked slowly around the enormous American fighter plane. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt towered before him, its massive 18-cylinder engine housing dwarfing anything in the Japanese arsenal. Lieutenant Yamamoto had been assured by his superiors that Japanese aircraft would dominate the skies through superior maneuverability and skilled pilots. Looking at this metal behemoth, he wondered if perhaps they had gravely miscalculated. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. The examination of this captured American aircraft would forever change how Lieutenant Yamamoto and his fellow pilots understood the nature of aerial warfare in the Pacific. What began as technical curiosity would transform into a profound realization about industrial might, engineering philosophy, and ultimately, the inevitable outcome of a conflict between nations with vastly different manufacturing capabilities. The Thunderbolt had been recovered nearly intact after an emergency landing behind Japanese lines 3 days earlier. Its American pilot had been captured and transferred for interrogation, but the aircraft itself remained at Hollandia, providing the Japanese with a rare opportunity to examine their enemy's technology up close. Lieutenant Yamamoto had been specifically selected for this task due to his engineering background at Tokyo Imperial University before the war. "This cannot be correct," Yamamoto muttered, checking his measurements again. He ran his hands along the armor plating behind the cockpit, measuring its thickness with calipers. "Hiroshi, come verify these numbers." Flight Sergeant Hiroshi Tanaka hurried over, clipboard in hand. A former mechanic for Mitsubishi before being drafted, Tanaka had a practical understanding of aircraft construction that complemented Yamamoto's theoretical knowledge. 8.6 millimeters at the thinnest point, sir," Tanaka confirmed after taking his own measurements, "and the plate extends completely around the pilot's position." "Nearly 4 times thicker than our Zero's protection," Yamamoto said quietly. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt represented everything the Japanese aircraft industry was not. Where Japanese designs like the famous A6M0 emphasized lightness, maneuverability, and range at the cost of protection, this American fighter seemed built around the opposite philosophy: overwhelming power, rugged construction, and pilot survival above all else. Commander Shigeru Nakajima, the senior officer overseeing the examination, approached with a frown creasing his weathered face. At 44, Nakajima was considerably older than most pilots. Having learned to fly in the 1920s, he had fought in China and seen the evolution of air combat firsthand. "What have you discovered that concerns you so deeply, Lieutenant?" he asked, noting Yamamoto's expression. "Sir, this aircraft weighs approximately 7,000 kilograms when fully loaded," Yamamoto replied. "Our A6M weighs less than half that. Yet the American plane carries 8 heavy machine guns with more ammunition than our entire squadron carries collectively." Nakajima's frown deepened. "And its performance?" "Based on recovered intelligence and our own observations, despite the weight difference, its top speed exceeds our Zero by nearly 100 kilometers per hour." The 3 men fell silent, the implications hanging heavily between them. It was Tanaka who finally spoke, his voice barely audible over the ambient jungle sounds. "How is this possible, Lieutenant?" The answer lay in the massive engine compartment at the nose of the Thunderbolt. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double-wasp radial engine produced over 2,000 horsepower, nearly twice what the Sakai engines in their Zeros could generate. "Industrial capacity," Yamamoto answered simply. "This engine alone would consume more raw materials than our entire aircraft. America builds these as if resources are unlimited." The examination continued throughout the morning as they methodically documented every aspect of the Thunderbolt. Each discovery painted a clearer picture of the fundamental differences in design philosophy and manufacturing capabilities. "Look at this," Tanaka called out, having opened an access panel beneath the cockpit. "The control cables are duplicated. Even if one is severed, the pilot retains control." Commander Nakajima nodded grimly. While our pilots rely on skill to avoid being hit, the Americans build their aircraft assuming they will be hit. This revelation struck Yamamoto like physical blow. The Japanese military doctrine emphasized the spiritual strength and superior training of its personnel. The Bushido code valued the warrior over his tools. Yet here was an approach that seemed to invert that thinking entirely. The American philosophy appeared to value the preservation of both machine and pilot above all else. As their inspection continued, they were joined by Captain Kenji Okada, a veteran pilot with over 30 combat missions, who had claimed to have defeated 2 Thunderbolts in aerial combat. "Impossible," he declared upon hearing their findings about the armor protection. "I personally witnessed my 20mm cannon shells strike a Thunderbolt last month. The aircraft went down." "Were you able to confirm the downing?" Yamamoto asked carefully. Okada hesitated. "No. Cloud cover prevented visual confirmation, but the American was trailing smoke heavily." "Captain, please examine this." Yamamoto directed Okada to the self-sealing fuel tanks they had just inspected. Unlike the vulnerable fuel systems in Japanese aircraft that would leak and often ignite when punctured, the American design incorporated rubber layers that would expand when damaged, sealing the hole and preventing fuel leakage. "What you witnessed as smoke may have been fuel vapor, temporarily escaping before the tank sealed itself," Yamamoto explained. "Based on what we're seeing here, that Thunderbolt likely returned to its base." The color drained from Okada's face as he considered how many of his claimed victories might have actually survived. This had profound implications, not just for individual combat records, but for the entire strategic assessment of the air war. By midday, the heat inside the aircraft had become oppressive, and the inspection team took a break in the shade of a nearby maintenance hangar. The mood was somber as they shared water and rice balls prepared by the airfield kitchen. "There is another factor we must consider," Commander Nakajima said after a long silence. "Production numbers." He unfolded a document from his breast pocket, an intelligence report compiled from various sources, including radio intercepts and reconnaissance. "Our best estimates suggest the Americans produced over 5,000 Thunderbolts last year alone. Our total aircraft production across all types was less than half that number." The implications were clear. Even if Japanese pilots maintained a favorable exchange ratio, they would eventually be overwhelmed by sheer numbers. The afternoon examination revealed even more discouraging details. The .850 caliber Browning machine guns carried by the Thunderbolt could deliver a combined weight of fire that dwarfed the armament of the Zero. Each gun was fed by a belt containing approximately 400 rounds, giving pilots the freedom to fire extended bursts without the careful ammunition conservation required of Japanese aviators. "Their pilots need not be exceptional marksmen," Nakajima observed. "With this volume of fire, they need only point their aircraft in the general direction of their target." As they continued their examination, a messenger arrived with news that further complicated their understanding. An interrogation of the captured American pilot had revealed that the Thunderbolt they were examining was not even the latest version. Newer models with additional improvements were already deploying to the Pacific Theater. The setting sun cast long shadows across the airfield as they completed their inspection. Lieutenant Yamamoto made one final note in his report before closing his notebook. "Commander," he said quietly, "there is one more thing we should consider." Nakajima raised an eyebrow expectantly. "The pilot of this aircraft survived his landing. Had this been one of our fighters, the likely outcome would have been very different." The commander nodded, understanding the full weight of this observation. Japanese aircraft, with their lightweight construction and minimal protection, offered little chance of survival in a crash or forced landing. The Thunderbolt, with its robust construction and armored cockpit, had allowed its pilot to walk away from a substantial impact. "A downed American pilot may fly again tomorrow," Yamamoto continued. "Our pilots do not often get second chances." This stark reality represented perhaps the most significant advantage the Americans possessed: the preservation of experienced air crews. While Japanese pilots would fight until death or serious injury removed them from service permanently, American pilots could survive multiple forced landings or bailouts, gaining experience with each mission. That evening, the inspection team gathered in a small room adjacent to the Airfield Operations Building to compile their findings. Maps of the Pacific Theater covered one wall, with markers indicating the steady retreat of Japanese forces over the preceding months. "We must be realistic about what this means," Commander Nakajima addressed the group. "The technological gap is widening, not narrowing." Captain Okada, still processing the implications for his combat record, spoke up defiantly. "Superior spirit can overcome superior machinery. One skilled samurai could defeat many lesser opponents, regardless of their weapons." "With respect, Captain," Yamamoto responded carefully, "aerial combat is not swordsmanship. When an aircraft with twice the horsepower, twice the armament, and twice the protection engages, spirit alone cannot overcome such disparities." The debate continued late into the night, reflecting the larger philosophical struggle within the Japanese military, the tension between traditional warrior values and the cold realities of modern industrial warfare. 3 weeks later, Lieutenant Yamamoto found himself facing the very aircraft he had studied so meticulously. Flying his A6M0 on a patrol mission near Biak Island, his squadron encountered a formation of Thunderbolts escorting bombers toward Japanese positions. "Enemy aircraft at 2 o'clock high," crackled the voice of his wingman, Ensign Sato, through his radio. "Approximately 12 bombers with fighter escort." "Maintain formation," ordered squadron leader Matsuda. "We will climb to gain altitude advantage before engaging." Yamamoto felt a chill despite the tropical heat of his cockpit. His Zero, with its exceptional rate of climb, began ascending rapidly, but he knew what awaited them. The Thunderbolts would use their superior speed in a diving attack, making a single pass before using their power to escape back to altitude, refusing to be drawn into the turning fight where the Zero held advantage. "Remember what we discussed," Yamamoto transmitted to his fellow pilots. "Do not pursue them in a climb. Force them to turn or disengage." The engagement unfolded exactly as he had anticipated. The American fighters dove through their formation at high speed, their combined firepower overwhelming 1-0 immediately. Yamamoto pulled his aircraft into a tight turn, forcing and pursuing Thunderbolt to overshoot. For a brief moment, he had a firing opportunity and squeezed his trigger, watching as his 20mm cannon shells struck the American fighter. Smoke trailed from the Thunderbolt, but instead of falling from the sky as Japanese doctrine predicted, the American aircraft leveled out, accelerated, and rejoined its formation. Just as Yamamoto had discovered in his inspection, the Thunderbolt absorbed damage that would have destroyed a Japanese aircraft. The battle lasted less than 10 minutes, but the results were devastating. 4 Zeros were lost against a single Thunderbolt that was seen trailing smoke but still flying under control. The remaining Japanese fighters were forced to retreat as their fuel reserves dwindled, another critical disadvantage compared to the long-range American aircraft. Upon returning to base, Yamamoto immediately sought out Commander Nakajima to share his combat observations, which had painfully confirmed their technical assessment. "They did not pursue us when we disengaged," Yamamoto reported. "They prioritized their primary mission, bomber escort, over individual victories." This represented another fundamental difference in approach. While Japanese pilots sought personal combat achievements, the Americans operated with strategic discipline, focusing on mission objectives rather than personal glory. Over the following months, Lieutenant Yamamoto's understanding of the air war continued to evolve through both combat experience and intelligence reports. The American industrial juggernaut was now producing aircraft at a rate that seemed impossible. One report indicated that a new Thunderbolt rolled off the production line every hour. By late August 1944, the strategic situation had deteriorated further. American forces had established air supremacy over much of the southwestern Pacific, and Japanese aircraft were increasingly reserved for critical operations or last-ditch defensive efforts. On September 3rd, Lieutenant Yamamoto was summoned to Imperial Navy headquarters in Rabaul, where he found himself facing a panel of senior officers, including Admiral Takeo Kurita. "Lieutenant, we have reviewed your report on the American fighter capabilities," the Admiral began. "Some have suggested your assessment is overly pessimistic and damaging to morale." Yamamoto stood rigidly at attention. "Sir, I reported only what I observed firsthand." A heated debate ensued among the officers present. Some dismissed the technological disparities, insisting that Japanese spirit and skill would prevail. Others, particularly those with engineering backgrounds, recognized the validity of Yamamoto's analysis. Admiral Kurita finally raised his hand for silence. "The Emperor has been promised victory by this command. We cannot now report that defeat is inevitable due to material factors. With respect, Admiral," Yamamoto ventured carefully, "acknowledging reality might allow us to adapt our tactics and training to compensate for these disadvantages." To his surprise, the Admiral nodded slowly. "What do you propose, Lieutenant?" In the hours that followed, Yamamoto outlined a revised approach to pilot training and aircraft deployment that emphasized survival and mission success over individual combat victories. Pilots would be taught to identify the specific weaknesses of American aircraft, the limited low-speed maneuverability of the Thunderbolt, its relatively poor performance at very low altitudes, and its large turning radius. Rather than engaging in direct confrontation where their advantages prevail, we should focus on ambush tactics from below, using terrain masking where possible, and disengaging immediately after the initial pass, Yamamoto explained. While some officers dismissed these suggestions as contrary to Bushido principles, Admiral Kurita authorized a limited implementation of the new tactics for squadrons operating in the Philippines sector. The following weeks saw a modest improvement in the exchange ratio for units employing the revised approach. Rather than losing 4 or 5 aircraft for every American plane downed, they achieved near parity in some engagements. However, the overwhelming numerical advantage of the Allied forces meant that even equal exchanges would eventually exhaust Japanese air power. In October, Yamamoto was transferred to the Philippines as air operations became increasingly focused on defending the islands from the American return. There, he encountered Flight Lieutenant James Miller, the captured pilot of the Thunderbolt he had examined months earlier, who had been brought to the same base for additional questioning about newer American aircraft models. Under the supervision of guards, the two aviators engaged in a remarkable conversation, technical rather than political, professional rather than adversarial. "Your Thunderbolt survived a crash landing that would have destroyed our aircraft," Yamamoto admitted. "We found that most impressive." Miller nodded. "Republic built them like tanks. We have a saying, if you want to get home, fly a Thunderbolt. Our pilots are taught that a Zero can outmaneuver any opponent," Yamamoto continued. "And they can," Miller acknowledged. "I was warned never to try turning with a Zero, but we don't need to turn with you when we can boom and zoom, dive through your formation at high speed, then climb away before you can respond." This candid exchange confirmed everything Yamamoto had observed and reported. The Americans understood the limitations of their aircraft, just as they recognized its strengths, and they developed tactics specifically to maximize advantage while minimizing exposure to their weaknesses. As their conversation concluded, Miller made an observation that would haunt Yamamoto. "You know, Lieutenant, my Thunderbolt was already considered obsolete when I was shot down. The P-47D models are being replaced by P-51 Mustangs in Europe. Those will probably reach the Pacific soon." The implication was clear. The technological gap would continue to widen. Even as Japanese aircraft development stalled due to material shortages and bombing of homeland factories, American designs were evolving rapidly, incorporating combat lessons and introducing new capabilities. When Yamamoto returned to his quarters that evening, he wrote a private letter to his younger brother, who was completing flight training in Japan. "Kenji, they tell you that spirit overcomes all obstacles, that determined warriors can defeat any enemy regardless of their weapons. In the air, I have learned that this is not always true. A pilot in a wooden aircraft facing one protected by steel begins the battle at a disadvantage that no amount of skill can fully overcome. I tell you this not to discourage you, but because knowledge may preserve your life where ignorance would surely end it." The American liberation of the Philippines began in late October, bringing unprecedented air power to bear on Japanese positions. Yamamoto's squadron, now reduced to less than half its original strength, was tasked with intercepting American bombing raids, effectively suicide missions against overwhelming odds. On November 12th, Yamamoto led 6 Zeros against a formation of 24 B-24 Liberator bombers escorted by 16 Thunderbolts. Using the tactics he had developed, they approached from below, using scattered cloud cover for concealment until the last possible moment. "Attack and break away immediately," he ordered as they closed with the bomber formation. "Do not engage the escorts in extended combat." The initial pass proved successful. 2 bombers sustained damage and fell behind their formation, but the Thunderbolt escorts responded with disciplined precision, diving to intercept the Japanese fighters as they attempted to make a second attack run. What followed demonstrated the brutal arithmetic of modern air warfare. The Thunderbolts, with their superior speed and firepower, engaged the Zeros from advantageous positions. Yamamoto watched as Ensign Sato's aircraft disintegrated under the concentrated fire of 50 caliber machine guns, then narrowly avoided the same fate by executing a diving spiral toward the deck, a maneuver that the heavier American fighters couldn't follow without risking structural failure. 3 of the 6 Zeros were lost in exchange for a single Thunderbolt that collided with debris from a Japanese aircraft. The remaining pilots, including Yamamoto, limped back to base with damaged aircraft and dwindling fuel reserves. Upon landing, Yamamoto learned that their airfield would be evacuated the following day, with all serviceable aircraft redeploying to Luzon. The American advance had accelerated beyond intelligence estimates, another sign of the overwhelming force being brought to bear. As ground crews worked through the night to prepare the remaining aircraft, Yamamoto sought out Commander Nakajima, who had been reassigned to the Philippines theater as Air Group Commander. "The tactical adjustments have helped, but they cannot change the strategic reality," Yamamoto reported. "For every aircraft we preserve through cautious engagement, they deploy 3 new ones." Nakajima nodded grimly. "I have received new orders from Imperial Headquarters. We are to prepare for special attack missions." Yamamoto felt his stomach tighten. Special attacks, what would later become more widely known as kamikaze missions, represented the final desperate strategy of an air force that could no longer compete on conventional terms. "Using pilots as guided missiles," Yamamoto said quietly. "Is this what we've been reduced to?" "It is the logical conclusion of our situation," Nakajima replied, his voice heavy with resignation. "If our aircraft cannot survive extended combat, and if each pilot has only a small chance of returning from any mission, then maximizing the damage inflicted in a single deliberate strike becomes rational, however distasteful." The conversation was interrupted by air raid sirens. American carrier-based aircraft had launched a night attack against their position, a capability that Japanese forces lacked entirely. As they hurried to the shelters, Yamamoto reflected on the symmetry of their situation. The technological inspection that had begun his journey of understanding would end with the most ancient of tactics, the deliberate self-sacrifice of warriors facing insurmountable odds. The following morning revealed the effectiveness of the American raid. 3 of their 7 remaining aircraft had been destroyed on the ground, despite being dispersed and camouflaged. The airfield itself was cratered in several places, though a single runway remained usable. During the evacuation briefing, Yamamoto was surprised to learn that he would not be deploying to Luzon with the remaining aircraft. Instead, he was being sent to Japan to help train new pilots based on his combat experience against American fighters. "Your knowledge is now more valuable than your skill as a pilot," Nakajima explained as they prepared to part ways. "The next generation must understand what they will face without having to discover it for themselves." 3 days later, as his transport aircraft approached the Japanese home islands, Yamamoto gazed down at the industrial landscape below. The contrast with what he knew of American production capacity was stark, where U.S. factories operated around the clock with seemingly unlimited resources. Japanese manufacturing was increasingly dispersed, hidden, and limited by critical shortages. At the training base near Nagoya, Yamamoto found himself facing classrooms of increasingly younger pilots, many with less than 30 hours of flight time due to fuel shortages. Their training program had been shortened repeatedly as the demand for replacement pilots outpaced the capacity to train them properly. "The American Thunderbolt weighs more than twice our Zero," he explained to one group. "But its power-to-weight ratio is actually superior due to its massive engine. You cannot outrun it in level flight or in a dive." A young pilot raised his hand. "Sir, our instructors told us that our superior maneuverability makes our aircraft the finest fighter in the world." "The Zero remains the most maneuverable fighter," Yamamoto acknowledged. "But the Americans know this and refuse to engage on those terms. They attack from altitude, make a single firing pass, then climb away. They fight according to their advantages, not ours." This message contradicted much of what the trainees had been taught, creating visible confusion and concern. After one such session, the base commander, Captain Toshiro Watanabe, called Yamamoto to his office. "Your assessments of American capabilities are creating anxiety among the trainees," Watanabe stated bluntly. "Some instructors have complained that you are undermining confidence." "Captain, these pilots will face Thunderbolts and Mustangs within weeks of completing training," Yamamoto responded. "Confidence based on ignorance will get them killed even faster." "Nevertheless, you will moderate your descriptions of enemy capabilities," Watanabe ordered. "Emphasize the techniques for victory, not the probability of defeat." Yamamoto left the meeting troubled by the widening gap between official doctrine and battlefield reality. That evening, he modified his curriculum as ordered, but included practical demonstration flights where experienced instructors played the role of American fighters, showing rather than telling the new pilots what they would face. In December 1944, as American B-29 superfortresses began appearing over Japan itself, the nature of the air war became impossible to disguise. Training schedules were compressed further, with final stage pilots being sent directly to units forming for special attack missions. During this period, Yamamoto encountered an old classmate, Hideki Matsumoto, who now worked at Mitsubishi's aircraft division. Over dinner at a small restaurant in Nagoya, they spoke candidly about the technological disparities Yamamoto had observed. "We knew about the armor and self-sealing tanks years ago," Matsumoto admitted, "but implementing similar features would have compromised the Zero's performance advantages. Our strategy required light, maneuverable fighters that could operate from carriers at long ranges." "And now?" Yamamoto asked. "Now we are developing interceptors like the Raiden that incorporate some of these protective features," Matsumoto replied. "But raw material shortages limit production. We can barely manufacture enough replacement aircraft to cover losses, let alone introduce new models in significant numbers." The conversation turned to production capacity. Matsumoto shared a stunning statistic. The American Republic factory in Farmingdale alone produced more P-47 Thunderbolts each month than all Japanese factories combined produced Zeros. "It is not just a battle of technologies," Matsumoto concluded, "but a battle of industrial capacity. They can afford to armor their aircraft because they have the materials and production capability to absorb the added weight without sacrificing performance." In early 1945, as American forces secured Luzon and prepared for operations against Iwo Jima and Okinawa, Yamamoto received unexpected orders to report to an engineering facility outside Tokyo. There, he found a captured P-47D model Thunderbolt, a newer version than the one he had examined in New Guinea, being systematically studied. Professor Jiro Horikoshi, chief designer of the Zero, was personally supervising the examination. The legendary engineer greeted Yamamoto warmly, having read his detailed reports from the previous year. "You identified many of the key features that give this aircraft its remarkable survivability," Horikoshi said. "We are now trying to determine which elements could be incorporated into our designs within current material constraints." The newer Thunderbolt model revealed further enhancements: additional armor protection, improved engine cooling, and increased ammunition capacity. Most significantly, it featured water injection for the engine, allowing brief periods of substantially increased horsepower during combat. "They continue to evolve their designs based on combat experience," Horikoshi observed. "While we have been forced to simplify ours for faster production with fewer strategic materials." The following day, they were joined by several senior officers from Imperial headquarters, including General Torishiro Kawabe, who was conducting an assessment of air defense capabilities against the increasing B-29 raids. Could we not develop specialized interceptors that incorporate these protection features? General Kawabe asked after reviewing their findings. Aircraft designed specifically to engage their bombers. We have several designs that could be effective, Horikoshi replied cautiously. But aluminum allocation for aircraft production has been reduced by 40% in the last 6 months. Steel is prioritized for naval construction, and aviation fuel quality has declined as petroleum stocks are depleted. The general's expression darkened. So we face not merely a technological gap, but a fundamental resource disparity that cannot be overcome through design improvements alone. That is correct, sir, Horikoshi confirmed. At current production rates, even if we were to develop a fighter equal or superior to the Thunderbolt, we could manufacture perhaps 100 aircraft per month against the thousands being produced by American factories. This stark assessment eliminated any remaining illusions about the potential outcome of the air war. What had begun for Yamamoto as a technical evaluation of an enemy aircraft had evolved into a comprehensive understanding of the insurmountable advantages held by the American war machine. In the months that followed, Yamamoto divided his time between training duties and consultation with aircraft designers, working on next-generation fighters that would likely never see mass production. The air defense situation deteriorated steadily, with American fighters increasingly operating with impunity over Japanese territory. In June 1945, during a training flight near Yokohama, Yamamoto encountered a formation of Mustangs, the successor to the Thunderbolt in many American units. Flying a Ki-84 Hayate, the most advanced Japanese fighter available in numbers, he found himself outmatched in every performance category. After evading the American fighters by descending to rooftop level through the smoke of a recent bombing raid, Yamamoto made an emergency landing at a secondary airfield when his fuel ran critically low. There, he encountered a group of maintenance personnel attempting to repair aircraft with improvised parts fabricated from scavenged materials. "We have not received a proper shipment of replacement parts in over 2 months, the maintenance chief explained. "We are keeping aircraft flying by cannibalizing those too damaged to repair." This encounter highlighted another critical advantage held by American forces. Their robust logistics and supply chain remained intact, while Japan's had been systematically destroyed by submarine warfare and strategic bombing. Returning to the training base, Yamamoto found orders awaiting him for his final assignment of the war. He was to report to Matsushiro in central Honshu, where an underground headquarters complex was being constructed. There he would serve on the air planning staff for the defense of the home islands against the anticipated American invasion. The journey to Matsushiro took him through regions devastated by bombing. Formerly thriving industrial cities had been reduced to burned-out shells. The civilian population, once confident in ultimate victory, now focused solely on daily survival. At Matsushiro, Yamamoto joined a planning team that included representatives from all service branches. Their task was to organize the remaining air assets, less than 2,000 combat aircraft of all types, many in poor condition with inadequately trained pilots, to inflict maximum casualties during the initial landing operations. Colonel Saburo Shindo, the senior air staff officer, reviewed their inventory with grim realism. "We have perhaps 1 month of aviation fuel at current consumption rates. Every operational aircraft will be committed to special attack missions, primarily against troop transports rather than warships." The planning sessions continued day and night, but an undercurrent of fatalism pervaded the discussions. Most officers understood that they were organizing the final expenditure of Japan's air power in a campaign that could not alter the strategic outcome. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito's surrender announcement was broadcast throughout the complex. Some officers responded with disbelief or calls for continued resistance, but most received the news with quiet resignation. The path from technological disadvantage to strategic defeat had become increasingly apparent to those with first-hand experience of the disparities. In the days that followed, Yamamoto was tasked with preparing documentation on Japanese aircraft capabilities for the occupation authorities. This assignment brought him full circle, from studying American aircraft to explaining Japanese designs to their former adversaries. On September 9th, as he completed this work, Yamamoto received a visitor, United States Army Air Force's Major Robert Williams, a former Thunderbolt pilot now serving with the Technical Intelligence Section of the Occupation Forces. "Lieutenant Yamamoto," Williams greeted him in accented Japanese, "I understand you conducted a technical evaluation of a P-47 last year. We'd like to see your report." Yamamoto provided his original notes and findings. Williams reviewed them with professional interest, occasionally nodding in agreement with specific observations. "Your assessment was remarkably accurate," Williams commented, "especially regarding the protective systems." "The Thunderbolt was an education," Yamamoto replied carefully. "It revealed much about American industrial philosophy." Williams smiled slightly. "The jug, that's what we called it, wasn't subtle or elegant, but it brought pilots home when they had no right to survive. One pilot in my squadron returned with over 300 holes in his aircraft." Their conversation continued for several hours, two professional airmen discussing the technical aspects of the machines they had flown in combat against each other. As they concluded, Williams made an observation that summarized the fundamental lesson Yamamoto had learned through his examination of the Thunderbolt. "You know, Lieutenant, American and Japanese aircraft reflected our different national approaches to warfare. Your designers built masterpieces of maneuverability that extended your tactical reach, but required exceptional pilots and offered little protection. We built reliable, powerful aircraft that could absorb punishment and be mass-produced by workers with minimal training. In the end, industrial capacity proved more decisive than individual pilot skill." Yamamoto nodded, recalling his first walkthrough of the captured Thunderbolt more than a year earlier. "I reached the same conclusion after measuring the armor plating behind the pilot's seat. Our entire approach to aerial warfare was based on assumptions that no longer applied in an age of industrial mass production." In the years that followed, Yamamoto would join Japan's reconstituted civil aviation industry, eventually working with American aerospace companies as Japan rebuilt its industrial base. The lessons he had learned from the Thunderbolt, redundant systems, pilot protection, and robust construction would influence a generation of Japanese engineers who went on to create some of the most reliable aircraft in the world. The technological insights gained from that inspection in the jungles of New Guinea had revealed not just the capabilities of a single fighter aircraft, but the fundamental advantages of American industrial might that would ultimately determine the outcome of the Pacific War. What began as a technical evaluation of an enemy aircraft became a window into the inevitable conclusion of a conflict between nations with vastly different manufacturing capabilities. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.